Well, hello, LitCritters. Hello, coaches. A session of literary criticism. We're going to look at, we're going to approach the 2020-2021 reading list. As well you know, because no doubt you've gotten into it already. Some of you started over the summer. We're working with Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Our play this year, author Miller's Death of a Salesman. And we're going to look at some of William Wordsworth's poetry. Poetry selected, in part, the shorter ones, the best of Wordsworth, his longer poems, some of them terribly long. I don't mean anyway, very long. What I'm going to do, and you have it in front of you, I hope, the handout associated with this particular session, the reading list, and I have a couple of pages on Conrad, one or so on Miller, and then Wordsworth, the follow-up. What I've done over the past 12 years or so is simply read from this, adding to it kind of annotation there in a face-to-face, either during Capital Conference or with the student activity conferences, none of which are face-to-face this year. So it is that I invite you, if it comes to a point where you scribble something down and want to send me a question, do so. My new email is mwbern@att.net. I find after I read these, not intending in any way trying to pull them together, I usually look for, and I'm usually pretty successful, not that there's only one theme for any work, but there seems to be at times something in the way of resonance. There's an echoing forward, echoing backwards. And what I found in reading these three authors, particularly Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Miller's Death of a Salesman, and the poems, and not necessarily the poems themselves, but what drives Wordsworth when he writes the poems, a commonality of sorts, and it's included here in the title of the overviews that I've put together. Excuse me as I read, and the paper I'll try to keep out of the camera. Marlowe, he's our first-person narrator in Heart of Darkness. Lohman, he's our protagonist, Willie Lohman, in Miller's Death of a Salesman. And Wordsworth, mostly a speaker in his poems, every now and then a persona, but mostly the speaker, and the august light of abiding memories, a line taken from the reading. Conrad's Heart of Darkness. As we go through, especially with Conrad, and especially the coaches, but certainly not to the exclusion of the young lit critters who may have read some of the works I make reference to, or may want to for reasons varying, I will allude to works that echo what Conrad's doing. Conrad's living in a time at the beginning of the 19th century. Did I say that correctly? Nope. The beginning of the 20th century, wherein there was quite a experiment in telling stories. Ford Madox Ford and Joseph Conrad on one side of the ocean, on the other side of the ocean, Henry James. These authors were trying to discover the best way to tell a story. Out of that comes Charles Marlowe, the narrator of not only Heart of Darkness, but several other of Conrad's endeavors. So I read, and I interrupt myself every now and then, and you take notes so that you can send me questions if so you wish. In his Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad offers a framework story, a central narrative of which is spoken by one of 5 men who share the bond of the sea. The allusions, not that Conrad's working off of this, but you as a literate audience know of Stephen Crane's The Open Boat. You know of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Canterbury Tales is a framework story. We're in a first-person narrator. Chaucer himself, not as the poet, but as the journey, as pilgrim, as the narrator, tells and retells stories. And in Stephen Crane's The Open Boat, we have an unnamed narrator, and there's argument who it is or who it isn't in this little boat. And this is an isolation. What we have here is Conrad creating that kind of isolation, not Geoffrey Chaucer's pilgrimage to Canterbury, but there on the Nelly, as we will spend some time, this boat that's anchored in the estuary, in the flowing forward and the ebbing backward of the most important river in the world for the longest time, the Thames, there upon which London is built, Canterbury by extension. In his Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad offers a framework story, the central narrative of which is spoken by one of 5 men who share the bond of the sea. The framing narrative's unnamed narrator does little more than raise and lower the curtain on the young, now experienced Charles Marlowe, who shares his own story while the 5 sit on the Nelly, a cruising yawl, on the ebbing Thames in the darkness that hangs at the edge of the lurid glare of civilization's principal city, the commercial center of a vast colonial empire. We'll speak of various themes, thematic concerns throughout the novel, and the literature about the literature, the secondary literature that addresses Conrad, all of his works, but here especially Heart of Darkness, is extensive. You're invited to go and read. But here we're focusing on, for the moment, this choosing of an audience. I take you to Henry James, whose Turn of the Screw it's a wonderful opening chapter. We'll call it a chapter, in which the narrator starts a story, and he describes, not unlike Chaucer does in his prologue to Canterbury Tales, describes those who are at the table feasting the night before they head off to Canterbury. What the narrator in James's Turn of the Screw does is kind of fake a reason for not telling the story that night, because he doesn't like who's sitting in the room. They are not going to make a good audience. And so in this manipulation, this fiction, this construction of a storytelling event, James has his narrator start his story the next night when he's satisfied with whom he will be working as in this narrative event, where you have a storyteller, and an audience, and it's the perfect audience for the story he's going to tell. So too we have here on the Nelly 5 people. One is the framework narrator, the other is Marlowe, and the other 3, there's an incidental indication that throughout the novel that they are there in the complete dark by the time the story gets started. And it is that Marlowe, Charlie Marlowe, is to some degree a famed storyteller, at least among these group. They know a story is coming, one of his yarns, one of his long tales. And the unnamed narrator retells a story that Charles Marlowe tells about events that had happened earlier in his life, and the conditioning, the distancing from the events themselves to the event we are part of as audience, is part of how Conrad has constructed this storytelling event. It is how I look at it as a, well, pragmatically speaking, a test maker, recognizing the distance between the events referred to in the story in time and in, well, you have someone who might have heard his friend's sister who knew somebody whose mother did something. We keep distancing so that the believability, the reliability, our term, is not questioned. If that first person were to start telling the story, our first question is he reliable? By the time we have an outside narrator who tells Marlowe's story, who's recounting things he heard and things he experienced, that distancing settles down that ironic notion of reliability in a first-person narration. And so we're on the Thames, and in the dark, that yawl shifts back and forth. The foundation, as it were, is metaphorically, symbolically shifting all the while. We're not too sure. We have to listen to this tale told among those who are bonded by the sea. We are listening in. The sharing, a storytelling concept foundational to many of Conrad's stories, as is Charlie Marlowe himself. There's an extra E I need to drop. Necessarily includes a larger audience, the readers, you and me. The unnamed narrator recounts Marlowe's beginning the telling of his story. And he says, I don't want to bother you much with what happened to me personally, he begins, showing in this remark the weakness of many tellers of tales who seem so often unaware of what their audience would best like to hear. Yet to understand the effect of it on me, you ought to know how I got out there, what I saw, how I went up that river to the place where I first met the poor chap. It was the furthest point of navigation and the culminating point of my experience. It seemed somehow to throw a kind of light on everything about me and into my thoughts. Here we have the fullness of the purpose in the storytelling itself from Conrad, the author's workings. He has his unnamed narrator suggest to us something about Marlowe, who is a narrator, who's suggesting this is not a story about me, but, and we know by that time, it's fully a story about him. Marlowe's telling is a chronological complexity whose temporal connections stretch across the backstories of empire, ancient and current. His story is indeed not simply a story of what happened to him personally. His recounting is an accounting of the effects of colonization. Much has been said, much has been contradicted. It's in the literature. You can't miss it if you step into the secondary literature, that this is a commentary on, this is a criticism of Britain's colonial empire, and it is, by extension, even by the way Marlowe makes reference all the way back to the Roman Empire, as the Roman soldiers came into the Britain in, well, not with Caesar, but later with Claudius in the 1st century, and conquered that land, and how it felt for a Roman to be so far from home. Coaches, there's some great poetry you might find out there. Robert Graves has some, and Hardy has some, and Kipling has some, wherein the poetry is the persona, the Roman soldier speaking about that isolation, that same isolation that Marlowe himself feels. And the director and the accountant and everybody on that yawl there, on the Nelly there, and the gloaming and into the darkness as his story is being told, they understand. They come from the same country. That is, they come from the sea. Picking up, his recounting is an accounting of the effects of colonization. It is a reflective assessment of what happens to both the subjugated and the subjugators. I suggest that you remind yourself of Eric Blair, writing under the pseudonym George Orwell, Shooting an Elephant, how it is that someone who is representing the empire suffers as much as the empire makes they who are subjugated, those who are doing the subjugation are affected by empire. A present time assessment by someone whose encounter with the dirtiness and especially the inefficacy, of empire's work recognizes an invitation to understand a quality not afforded him during his prior open sea experiences. Marlowe recounts a French man-of-war's firing of fusillades into the coastal reaches of the jungle. His critical assessment, Marlowe's, which is essentially a condemnation of the ineffectual, contrasts with his very personal experience on the river just below the interior station. This experience is first-hand and inarguably existential. His presence represents the empire's commercial reach, and the arrows and the spears, the fusillade from within the dense jungle, that Marlowe himself experiences confirms his participation in Empire's work. He's not the spectator as he watches from the French steamer as the French man of war is firing cannon artillery into the jungle, seemingly ineffectual. It is that he is going upriver later on, several months later, and the same thing in reverse happens to him as the arrows come out of the jungle. That his understanding never fully ensues contributes to the inherent 20th century-ness of the storytelling. Again, experimenting with how it is that stories are told. And as we get deeper into the 20th century, you may recall that a lot of short stories don't have endings. We are quite used to novels coming out of the 18th century, the 19th century, the short stories of the latter part of the 19th century, the heyday of the short story. There was always seemingly always an ending wherein a moral is very explicit. And here it is that Marlowe is a creation of Conrad. Marlowe is still learning from his experience as Conrad is learning from his experience on the sea and chronicling it in his novels. Going to the second page, in his final two sharings, the first with the intended and the second with us, the readers, via the unnamed frame stories narrator, both failed to suggest a full understanding. This concluding acquiescence to the ineffable is offered by the framing stories narrator, whose description of the immediate setting, the tranquil waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth, flowing somber under the overcast sky, seemed to lead into the heart of an immense darkness, parallels the yawl's tenuous mooring there in the river's tidal variance. The light of truth and the light of civilization never conjoined in Marlowe's estimation, to which Marlowe often refers is not in ascendancy. There is not, in contrast to perhaps Stephen Crane's The Open Boat, a certitude in the moral sentence, an echoing of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. We know what that tale, whether it's the Mariner's Tale or the unnamed narrator in The Open Boat, we know what is intended by the story being told. Here we are kind of left in the dark on the yawl as Marlowe's story comes to an end. Communication, including its failure, the crippled steamship as the only connection between the stations, and the lie that Marlowe proffers the intended, is at the core of Conrad's tale. Silence is often at the margins. Charles Marlowe's commission rests on his fluency in French. His control of the march to the central station depends on his addressing the caravan of 60 carriers in English with gestures, not one of which gesture is lost to the 60 pairs of eyes before him. The drumming of the drums there in the interior of Africa that echoes across the river and through the forest, the notebook's Russian cipher, the screeching of the steamer's whistle, and the fact that Marlowe can speak with Kurtz, who had been educated partly in England, served to bring the events, the plot line, forward. All these different modes of communication, or the failure in the attempt to communicate, all these bring forward through the plot line. However, it is in the aggregate, in the accumulation, in Marlowe's telling and our listening, ultimately in Conrad's first-person unnamed narrator's telling of Marlowe's tale, that distancing once again, that even as the darkness deepens, that darkness fully physical and fully symbolic, he can propose that the most you can hope from it is some sort of knowledge of yourself that comes too late, a crop of unextinguishable regrets, which he sees as perhaps the form of ultimate wisdom. And in some manner I see that, going back to the title, the august light of abiding memories, this recognition of something of oneself even if one doesn't understand the fullness of what one has experienced, there is that abiding set of memories that give birth to, if not a full understanding, at least toward an understanding of oneself, which form ultimate wisdom. Marlowe speaks of the original Kurtz, the dying Kurtz, and the Kurtz's shade, the Kurtz to whose creation all of Europe had contributed. It is noteworthy, and you will pick up on this very quickly, there are no names, places, or people in this novel. This is a full contribution without specificity. Well, there's a Swede, and you get a sense that sepulchral city, Brussels perhaps, or that city on the Thames, London, all these European powers who contribute to the demise, both in terms of the subjugated and those who subjugate, the fullness of experience as individuals in empire. All of Europe contributes to this. It is Kurtz and his treasure trove of ivory around which Conrad's tale revolves. That's the focus. Marlowe, as he approaches the door of the house in which waited the intended at the end of the telling of the story, as you well know, envisions a shadow insatiable of splendid appearances, of frightful realities, a shadow of the night draped nobly in the folds of a gorgeous eloquence. Again, the notion of language here, it's kind of a synesthesia, the visual of the beauty of the city and the eloquence, which is usually associated with speaking. There's something being said about empire here. Both Kurtz and Marlowe had gone upriver. Thresholds had been crossed. Liminality is a very important aspect of this novel. Liminality. Thresholds had been crossed and memories cataloged. However, it is only Marlowe, burdened by an active memory of Kurtz, who returns, beating those long odds inferred by the old physician in the sepulchral city. It is the old physician whose observation, change takes place inside, sets up our recognition that Marlowe's journey into the heart of darkness has little to do with the physical journey up that great unnamed river. It is in experiencing life's journey that we recognize our propensity for that which civilization hopes to restrain. There is no doubt that central to your experiencing the reading of the novel, that which Marlowe encounters when he finds Kurtz finally, and it seems as though Kurtz has gone well beyond the constraints of civilization to bring back to civilization the treasure, the ivory, that serves as that linkage between the subjugated and the subjugator. The barbarity that characterizes both the jungle and Kurtz's unrestrained actions and words is inseparable from the descriptions of the Africans who populate both the jungle and the story told. Conrad's characterization of Africa and its people has been subject to not so indiscriminate fusillades itself. The seminal attack being Chinua Achebe's An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. You should visit that, at least excerpt that. One of the LitCritters on the team might read it and excerpt it and bring forward this criticism that Conrad's novel suffers here in 1975, a good 3/4 of a century, and into a new colonial period. Imaginative fiction lives both in the contemporary stream and in tomorrow's archives. Cancel culture is very much a part of our present moment, and discussions along these lines can be productive. So what Achebe does with his criticism of Conrad and how Conrad's Heart of Darkness treats the African and the African cultures is finding some purchase, at least in terms of cancel culture, even into the 21st century. There are connections here. That Conrad's novella is an indictment of empire should not be forgotten. That Conrad's original audience lived in a very different world is no small thing. Perhaps a very close look at ourselves here in the 21st century, I suggest, here in what has been called the shining city on the hill, will allow us to get past the things that, in theory at least, most of us have in our day-to-day interactions moved beyond. Perhaps a very close look at ourselves will remind us that we still have a long way to go. Perhaps the journey will bring a bit more certainty than does listening to Marlowe's. Maybe. When I pull together, and so it's obvious I'm not giving you the questions I'm going to ask on the test, or any of the tests. What I give you is a semblance, a sense of what it is I find interesting in a novel, and necessarily out of that interest come the questions. As I've indicated, the characters don't have names, but the characters are important. The characters in Stephen Crane's The Open Boat, for the most part, don't have names. They represent something. And this journey up this unnamed river into the heart of darkness is symbolically paralleled with our own, as Marlowe says a couple of times, well, more so than that, a journey within oneself. It's a self-discovery. It's a self-discovery perhaps of what a culture thinks of itself, how it grows out of. And so it is that as we read this, we should be looking for not only thematic concerns, but events, moments that in the wonderful storytelling, using in a language he didn't learn until relatively late in past the critical period in his early 20s, he tells his story, does Conrad, in an English that is wonderfully ornate, but directed, every word seems to be directed to that fullness of effect, as Edgar Allan Poe speaks, that the effect of the story being told emphasizes what we know, what we need to know about the story as it's told. We learn from the story being told. We are participants. We are on that yawl, the Nellie, on the Thames, as the tide shifts, as we listen to Marlowe, remember that which he encountered some time back and what he brings forward into his life, and whatever he does, and the very contentious sort of thing within him, as he declares he does not lie. Yet everything he brings forward out of that adventure into the darkness, into the depth, into not the darkness of Africa in terms of, but darkness of Africa in terms of the European colonization that is infiltrating and changing things there, and what comes of that, which is promoted by greed. He brings that back, and when he speaks to Kurtz's intended, he has to lie. Is it a lie that we tell ourselves when we are, as a nation, as an empire, are engaged in colonialization? So the questions will be directed at events. The questions will be in terms of detail that mark the journey in some way. Nothing here, he's not a minimalist, Conrad is not a minimalist, but everything in the novel has a purpose because it's a rehearsed story. Conrad's Marlowe has had this on his mind, and he has found the perfect audience to tell his tale about this journey within himself. Watching the time here, so we need to move on, and we shall, to Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, page 3 of the handout. Play is a bit different in that it's a telescoped and hyperbolic, as I say all too often. You got to put the story on stage and get it done within 90 minutes or something like that. You very rarely have a story that lasts as long as Hamilton, let's say. And in this telescoping, And this hyperbole, where the good guys wear white hats and the bad guys wear black hats, or we don't lose track of that which is important, we have something along the lines of adherence or complete disregard of Aristotle's unities, the unities of time, action, and place. All this is in your handbook. Only one of those is Aristotle, but we don't need to get into that. And here we have author Miller. He takes a story of a lifetime, a very different sort of approach to Journey, contrast to Conrad's Marlowe. And we've got a 24-hour period, but as we'll talk about it in a minute, it's not dependent on flashbacks like the old Greek plays. Or it is that Miller, not unlike Conrad and Ford Madox Ford and Virginia Woolf and G.K. Chesterton, all those guys at the beginning of the 20th century trying to figure out how to tell a story well, no matter what the story is, it's the storytelling. Here it is that Miller, in the middle of the 20th century, comes up with, not for the first time, theater of the absurd had been going on, but what he does in experimental sort of finality, he compresses the present and the past into one timeline as experienced by someone who's having difficulty in life. And that's our friend Willy Loman. One of the world's most produced dramas, author Miller's Death of a Salesman, encompasses in its 2 acts roughly 24 hours of the drummer Willy Loman's life. A drummer, someone who drums up business. We don't use that term often enough. He's a salesman, a drummer, a salesman. His final 24 hours, however, the telling of the story masterfully renders the difficulties of a lifetime. The memories that comprise the fullness of Willy's story are not handled with flashbacks. The time structure of the play, in Miller's own words, is like a road cut through a mountain revealing its geological layers, and instead of one incident in one time frame succeeding another, the play displays past and present concurrently, with neither one ever coming to a stop. Willy's question is essentially American. Where's my place? The last thing you want to do in this culture we have is to cut in line. This is my place. It's not your place. We're always, all too often, we don't ask a question like this when we first meet somebody. How you doing? Is life okay? No. What's your place? Meaning, what do you do for a living? Where are you in this hierarchy of? We are very attentive to place in our culture. Where's my place? And Willy challenges Howard. There were promises made across this desk. While the search for certainty, specifically a company position that takes Willy off the road, the play script's timeline, at least on paper, the play script, can produce a degree of uncertainty that can be reckoned with only through performance. Unless you're really attentive, and if you are attentive, there's a word jump or something, you wonder whether there's an editing problem. But once it's put on stage, there's an irony here. The putting onto a page of a play, the liturgy, if you will. The play is not to be read by the readers, though here in literary criticism, that's what we do. We look at the page and we try to discern meaning. The meaning comes out of the performance. There's an irony there that the best writing in terms of concision, all that telescoping and all that hyperbole so we don't lose track of something, is not in its final analysis best on the page, it's best on the stage where we see the performance. And here with Miller's play, it's almost necessary to have the performance, the director and the actors, understand this script well enough that while it's being performed and we look through that fourth wall, it comes to life. That is, Willy Loman's being in the present and in the past at the same time. While the search for certainty, specifically a company position that takes Willie off the road, the play script's timeline on paper can produce a degree of uncertainty that can be reckoned only through performance. The play is not for the reader, it is for an audience that finds direction through the performance itself. And the performance invites the audience to the fourth wall into the time structure of Willie's meandering through the currency of his past present. The past presence of the play. Character development can be discerned and followed through a careful reading. Indeed, time slippage, that is the concurrency of Willie's past and present, is easily discoverable in the sudden shifts in Willie's focus, his conversation, and it is the explanatory nature of causal sequencing. Causal sequencing. Taking precedence over the temporal sequencing. So it might not be that what occurs on stage is happening the way it happened in time. We don't have the flashbacks, we have the past suddenly encroaching in on the present, and in that sudden appearance of the past to the present, we understand the causal sequencing. Temporal sequencing gives birth to an understanding of the causal sequencing. And so the reader and the performance's audience begin to understand the dynamics that define the characters' relationships, especially the play's own defining relationship, the one between father and son, that is between Willie and Biff. Reality, which is framed by the foils in the Loman's lives, the foil, a character who is present in a narrative, in a play, so that we understand what is normal. Good word coming from your handbook. Reality, which is framed by the foils in Loman's lives, not least of whom are Ben and Bernard, and some of whom inhabit the abiding, if not august, memories that are comprised of the family's illusions. Their expectations and their dreams often rudely crowds out those illusions and dreams. Reality doesn't take precedent. It is the dreams, it's the illusions, it's the expectations that foster the dreams and ensure the illusions. However, there is the patient Linda, who, as his foundations and support, is tethered to the shifting mooring that is Willie's intermittent presence in her life, and she is central to the audience's recognizing the differential that measures the distance between Willie's living the illusions and Biff's seeing through those illusions. Willie's and Linda's. Linda who, that is Willie's illusions and Linda's illusions. Linda who, at all costs, as Miller reminds us, must shield Willie from the truth, which is her contribution to the illusion. She knows from the get-go, when he wants to go out with Ben to Alaska, she knows the frailty of his ability, whatever extent that might be, psychological, physical, that's not his world, and she is there to shield him from reality quite often. The characters and the themes are masterfully intertwined, and in the conclusion, that is the play's observation of the American as salesman, as drummer, of himself. He's a salesman of himself. Willie knows this. Linda certainly knows this. We might break through the illusions to see our collective selves in our own 21st century service economy, with its 24/7 branding and rebranding and algorithm-directed drumming. And whether, as Miller argues, Willie has broken a law that says that men who fail in society and in business have no right to live, or, as Harold Bloom counters, our society suffers from a delusion that there is such a law. Having to encounter Willie's requiem might, just might, condition us as we face our own requiem. Know your characters, know the relationships. It's not a difficult one wherein we have a play that has Willie at least 2 stages of his life. Biff and Happy are both young men and children. Linda is her patient, abiding self all the way through. And it's the development of character in this construct, which is the past and the present, that makes it easy to understand who the characters are, but not so much how they develop, but how they have been developed. But your foils, all the other characters, and there are plenty in contrast to Conrad's Heart of Darkness, there are plenty of names in this play, and each one of them has some sort of relationship with the illusions and the dreams by virtue of their recognizing and fostering a notion of at least anchoring us in a reality that Willie doesn't, but Biff will, especially after that incident in the hotel, come to recognize fully. That is, Biff knows reality. So know the play in terms of characters, even if they're named once or twice, and only once or twice, what they represent up against Willie's illusions, the dreams and expectations, and the patience that is Linda's. Watching that clock, I am. Wordsworth's poetry. Page 4, please. Wordsworth, a poet of humanity and a poet of nature. He wittingly defined what became known as the Romantic period. As diverse as the period's authors are, and as various its literary works, Wordsworth, in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, any edition, especially the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, that preface there defines, it's a defense of, it's an apology for apologia. It is a definition of poetry here at the beginning of the 19th century. The author himself, Wordsworth, and his preface stand at the beginning of the Romantic period in England, and as it spreads to especially Germany and to the United States. The direction Wordsworth and Coleridge take English language poetic expression can be understood in a review of the subject matter upon which the anthology's poems dwell. Lyrical Ballads was published anonymously. They didn't want to take a chance with their reputations, Coleridge and Wordsworth. I believe the second edition, Coleridge didn't want his name on it, but Wordsworth had his name on it. It was a big swing from the normal, from what had come to be poetic expression during the 1700s, a little earlier and into the 1700s. My eyes are trying to find where I left off. The direction Wordsworth and Coleridge take English language poetic expression can be understood in a review of the subject matter upon which the anthology's poems dwell. The direction can be recognized also in the diction of the poems. Common, everyday objects, and especially people, are presented in common, everyday language. This is new. Take a sampling of neoclassic poetry and recognize that the subject matter, and this is following what the Greeks did, and this is following what the Romans did for the most part. They did a little bit differently with Terence, and that aside. It is that subject matter was not the everyday. With the Romantics, and with Wordsworth especially, this changes. Common should be understood in terms of shared, not common like it's just regular everyday stuff, but shared, those things that all of us encounter. The poetry of the neoclassic period that preceded the 19th century Romantic movement is characterized by an adherence to form and a reliance on elevated, well, more so, language style, both in conscious emulation of the ancients, particularly the Latin authors of the 1st and 2nd centuries. Indeed, the British poetry of the period is seen more as a study in plagiarism sometimes rather than simple emulation. You find the greats of the neoclassic period in the English language, in a real sense, just changing the names of the people and places and doing, especially in the satires, doing the same thing the Roman authors did when they wrote about Rome during the 1st and 2nd century. Here we have the English doing that. during the neoclassic period, neoclassic, the new classic, they're doing the same sort of thing. And along comes the likes of Wordsworth, especially Wordsworth, and argue, let's do something different and do it differently. Notwithstanding the late 18th century contributions of Thomas Gray, Elegy in a Country Churchyard, Robert Burns with his Scottish poetry, and William Blake with all that he did as a mythopoetic poet, 19th century poetics in full finds purpose, beginning with Wordsworth and Coleridge, as a reaction to, not a repudiation of, but a reaction to what had defined the Augustans and their immediate successors. Wordsworth's poetry, specifically our sampling of it, I've picked 20 relatively short poems. I believe it's about 20. I'm not sure that in the edition that some of you've gotten, that 2 of them show up, Matthew and another one. Pull them off the web, that'll be fine. I got a call halfway through the show over the summer from the publisher, and he says, the publisher, from the supplier, and he says, we've run out of American edition. Would the British edition be fine? I said, if it's the same content. Well, apparently it's not. Anyway, the poetry as it shows up, give or take a comma or 2 on the web, and in the anthology you're using, whichever one it ends up being, the British or the American printing, it's all the same, won't be a problem. So Wordsworth's poetry, specifically our sampling of these shorter poems, focuses on man's relationship with nature, again more specifically on man's failure to recognize that man is part of nature. His poetry focuses on the beauty of the usually unrecognized people with whom we engage every day. And it does so in an expressive mode that, unlike neoclassic poetry, does not draw attention to itself. Wordsworth maintains that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility, which might pre-echo, as we encounter Wordsworth poetry, Conrad's notion of the august light of abiding memories. There's this conscious effort on Wordsworth's point to make poetry seem an unconscious effort. He had a gift, so we are told by those who knew him well, and it's not in any way argued, that he could go for these long walks in the lake country and elsewhere and compose poetry aloud. They with whom he walked would hear him compose his poetry. And then he would come back and sit down, and Dorothy, his sister, very, very influential in all this, he would sit down and write what he had composed while walking, word for word, we are told. So this conscious effort to make it seem an unconscious effort to recollect that which, an admiration of the beauty of things we share, the common everyday, including the people, the flowers, the birds, the landscape, Tintern Abbey. These sorts of things, the beauty thereof is offered in what seems to be an unforced, a manner that is not reflective of its cleverness, as the neoclassic poems might suggest. All right, his is an artifice. Wordsworth has an artifice. An artifice, that's not a bad word. It means we make something that denies the artificial. And artificial is something that is made. That poetry should seem to be spontaneous, be a spontaneous overflow, speaks quietly to an effort to conform to a particular expectation. He puts the expectation there. And it is the effort that we can find his poetry conventions that define English language poetry. And it is the effort that we can find. I've dropped an in. In his effort that we can find conventions that define English language poetry, no matter the degree of reaction to their neoclassic overuse. So the things that we've always done, and if you read William Harmon, the guy who put together for us the handbook, his commentary on the history of poetry in the English language the last 1,500 years or so, suggesting that out of this growth of, this defining of English language poetry, much in borrowing, let's say, from the Italians with the sonnet, and out of the folk tradition, the ballads and all this. That stuff is there. Wordsworth does not eschew, he doesn't ignore that which he has inherited by virtue of the linguistic culture, which is the poetic expression in English. He uses that, but he celebrates it in a manner that does not draw attention to itself. Well, here we as literary critics, we need to discover that sort of thing. So even as in contrast to the neoclassic poetry, we don't see the form and we don't see the language and we don't see the figures of speech jumping out at us as if we have to do as the first player is told not to do in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Tone it down, tone it. We have to, even as Wordsworth has toned it down, I am going to ask you, did you see that word use? Did you discover that particular metric and that particular rhyme? Did you see what he did with inversion? He's still doing the stuff that we've always done in English language poetry. It's just not jumping out at us because it needs to seem as though it's a shared language about common, everyday sort of stuff. But what we'll recognize is the mechanics are still there. The literary techniques are still there. All those terms that are in the handbook are still there. Pay attention to them. And note that this is Wordsworth. He's the poet of choice this season. And if he uses a word, don't assume it's the word being used the way we use the word. The Oxford English Dictionary is a good fallback. Of course, there are footnotes and there are any number of things you can find on the web. But if the word, the way you use it here in the 21st century, doesn't quite fit, young people, into your understanding of what's going on in the poem, look that word up and see how it was used in the middle of the 19th century. The poem might make some more sense. So we find ourselves about 5 lines from the bottom of page 4 at the end. So we note the metric and melopoetic underlay of Wordsworth's ordinary language, the 19th century British use of the language. Wordsworth does not eschew rhyme and meter, though in some of his longer poems they seem altogether absent. The lyric mode is at his command. In his hands the closed form sonnet finds renewed opportunity. And perhaps the beauteous forms that we meet in our brief encounter with Wordsworth this season are not as a landscape to a blind man's eye. Rather, might they have no slight or trivial influence on the best portion of our own lives? Pulling from the poet himself, hoping that what he hoped, that his offering the world around him, whether it's humanity or nature. Some of his poetry is about the politicians of the age. Some of the romanticized insights and the shock to the French Revolution can be found in his poetry, autobiographical as it is. It is my invitation to you to sample by virtue of the poems I've listed on that reading list to see Wordsworth mainly as a speaker, but sometimes as a persona, understanding the world around him in the way that we do, more so than if we were, and we are not direct inheritors of the neoclassic period. We are directly, if nothing else, dependent on Wordsworth changing the way we use language in the poetic form. So, to understand the world around us. As you sample Wordsworth through the listing of poems, whether they're about nature, or whether they're about man, humanity, or man's having separated himself from the rest of nature, be aware of his success in creating this spontaneous overflow of emotion, recollected, not something that is, as the neoclassic might have penned a perfect line as Alexander Pope would do, and do, and do, and do. What a genius. But it is The aesthetic is strictly verse, to be admired as verse. We read a poem that Wordsworth, whether it's iambic pentameter or sonnet, everything perfect and expectations along those lines, or one of his blank verse, longer poems, intimations, immortality, lines written about Tintern Abbey, and suddenly we are immersed in the beauty of the language describing the beauty of the world around us. And then you and I, as literary critics, take a deep breath, having enjoyed the poem for what it does to us. Then we look what he does masterfully with the figures of speech, the auditory schemes, the rhymes, and all that sort of stuff. And then we take a test on it. So those are our three authors: Wordsworth with his poetry, selected; Arthur Miller with his tragedy of the common man, ourselves, drummers, salesmen, we all sell ourselves, Death of a Salesman; and Joseph Conrad's autobiographical into a fully symbolic recognition of how it is we reckon with being part of something larger than ourselves, which might well be just our consideration of ourselves, or in a very physical sense, the colonial expansive empire he was part of, we still are, and how the memories, how we negotiate the everyday by reliving that which has created us. So I hope to see you by way of an email sent my way, and have a good season, and stay very, very, very safe. Take care, and I'm signing out. Coaches, you have my email address. Bye-bye.